Yeah.
This is Geek Therapy Radio.
What are we waiting for?
And now your mental curator, Johnny Hamburger.
Welcome into Geek Therapy Radio. I just want to start this broadcast with hoping and wishing that everybody affected by Imelda flooding over the last week here on Thursday was when we got the bulk of the rain and the flooding. I hope you guys are doing okay. I sincerely hope and pray and wish for your quick recovery if your homes got flooded. I can't imagine, on that day. So my wife and I just bought a house, and this was the first kind of test of our neighborhood and any deficiency with our home in terms of leaks. And we found a few leaks, a couple leaks. Nothing that I would say at this point is major. We had some leaks inside the drywall, which caused some of our some of the paint to bulge and blister like a giant zit that we had to pop and drain the water out of. And we have to cut out a little section, a decent section of the drywall, a little section, maybe a couple feet by a couple feet, thereabouts. The window had a little leak. There's a little leak coming up under the carpet somewhere, but it wasn't nothing major. And I say that because a lot of homes flooded with a foot or two of water, even a few inches of water inside your home, standing water. It means your home is flooded. It means you have to gut the thing and basically start over again. And I can't imagine how many people like that this past week just went through Harvey. Like, how many homes they just got their furniture back in. They just ordered new furniture. They just had all the construction work done with their drywall and their foundations, and they just got back on their feet. And then another few inches of water in their house. Like, I can't. Those people. So all I'm saying is, my wife was concerned, as was I, about the few leaks in our house that we had. And it's scary and it's daunting because it's our first home. But I had to remember, and maybe I had a decent vantage point, on my normal shift during the week from noon to 8 p.m. is on KTRH. I run the board on KTRH. So we went into long form storm coverage, and we were just taking calls from all over the city of people stuck in on the roads mostly, but people having to be evacuated from their houses or leaving their houses because the water was rising. And I just kept in mind, and I reminded my wife that we are so unbelievably lucky that all we have are a few leaks that we have to take a couple hours on a Saturday to patch up drywall and put some gutters up. It's mind-boggling that our house didn't have gutters in certain areas, but we'll get those up, and it's a far cry. That minor inconvenience is a far cry from what others have gone through this week. So it's all about perspective, and that helped, of course, in our situation to ease our minds, but our hearts still go out to those affected by recent floodings of Imelda. Okay, moving on to geek stuff. I uploaded a podcast on Wednesday night before Imelda rolled through. Actually, I can't think it was kind of during, but it wasn't the flooding event like we had on the day after on Thursday. That podcast was about GameCube games coming to the Nintendo Switch, if and when they would ever. But the podcast got derailed by our two cats, Jack and Sassy, constantly bumping into the microphone, pawing at the door. I was trying to record it for YouTube. They're knocking over the camera by nudging the camera with their stupid faces. Also, what that was doing, it was derailing my train of thought constantly. I get on a good train of thought, try to be explaining things effectively, and then the cat would knock over the microphone, or I'd be yelling at a cat or tossing a cat out of the shot. It was a horrible train wreck. So I deleted that podcast because I didn't think it was very good, both in sound and just constantly losing my train of thought. So I want to recap what I meant there. And I'm going to do so by reading a YouTube comment that I made to somebody asking for some clarification by what I meant. So to preface this, I'll just say that no, I don't believe we will be getting many, if any, GameCube titles coming to the Switch. We might get a few, but not in the dumps that we've seen for the SNES and NES titles. And here's why. This is from my YouTube comment. Wii/GameCube games don't run flawlessly on the Dolphin emulator for Android, even on the Shield TV, which shares a similar Tegra X1 as the Switch. Dolphin struggles on Snapdragon 855, 855 Plus. Mario Galaxy was overhauled by Nintendo themselves and enhanced for the Shield TV in China. It wasn't a pixel-perfect port like NES, SNES titles are currently on the Switch. Nintendo has shown that modified GameCube titles can run on Tegra X1, but I highly doubt we'll see the bulk ISO ROM dumps like the NES and SNES. If Nintendo does release GameCube and Wii titles, they'll be reprogrammed from the ground up to run on the NVIDIA SoC. After all, GameCube and Wii graphics were handled by AMD, or ATI at the time. Same company. Now Nintendo uses NVIDIA. Switch can muscle out NES and SNES titles, etc., with pure emulation. GameCube and Wii will require complete programming overhauls, aka time and money investment. Thus, my lone opinion that GameCube and Wii titles on the Switch will be few and far between. So, listeners, to clarify, because GameCube and Wii games, which are essentially the same, cannot be purely just emulated on the Switch, that means they have to be reprogrammed from the ground up, which means for Nintendo to release GameCube games on the Switch, they would have to select and pick and choose which top-selling GameCube and Wii titles would sell well on the Switch to be worthy of the time and manpower investment in reprogramming those games to run on the Switch, because they can't just be emulated on the Switch. They were never programmed for the Switch. They were never designed for the Switch. The Switch system on chip, the NVIDIA Tegra X1, cannot just emulate Nintendo GameCube games. It can't do it. It's not there yet, nor will it possibly ever be. So, Nintendo will need to choose. Oh, does the original Luigi's Mansion, do we think that'll sell? Okay, invest all the time and effort into reprogramming that for the Switch, and we'll see how it goes. That's the only way that Nintendo Wii and GameCube titles will ever come to the Switch. I hope that makes sense. More Geek Therapy Radio coming up. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Geek Therapy Radio. If you're just joining us in the broadcast, I am your mental curator, Johnny Hemberger. Thanks for joining us. We have fun on the show. This isn't a show about possibly going to war with Iran or about border crisis or anything like that. This is kind of the lighter side of things, where I firmly believe we're all geeks about something. We all enjoy hobbies and we have our own different passions that we can bring to the table, and that is what's really important in the daily lives of listeners is basically what brings us joy, not what brings us all the hype and hate, but the things that are important to us: family, faith, friends, and our hobbies. So we talk about hobbies and our geek interests here on Geek Therapy Radio. So I wanted to clarify quickly to wrap up the last segment where I was talking about GameCube games on the Nintendo Switch. You can emulate Nintendo GameCube and Wii games on powerful smartphones, on ARM processors. So the latest ARM processors in our cell phones, at least, is the Snapdragon 855 and Snapdragon 855 Plus. Yes, you can download the Dolphin emulator. Yes, you can technically run GameCube and Wii games on that Dolphin emulator, but they are glitchy at best. You cannot run them at full 60 frames per second at best. Some games might be able to run at 60 frames per second, but they are not perfect. And by any means, that is not a product that Nintendo would ever sell to customers, ever. So I hear the argument when I bring this up all the time. Well, we can already emulate GameCube games and Wii games through the Dolphin emulator on our current smartphones, on the latest generations of smartphones. Yes, but it's glitchy, it's laggy, it's slow. Some games won't even run over 20 frames per second, even on the latest, greatest hardware of our smartphones. So while Nintendo can produce perfect emulation of NES games and Super Nintendo games, they can put that out on the Nintendo Switch and put their name on it, saying, yes, this is a perfect port, basically. We can run it through emulation with no problem because the Switch is so much more powerful than the NES and SNES. We can just muscle it out through emulation. You can't currently muscle out GameCube and Wii games with emulation on an ARM processor, on basically an NVIDIA system on chip. By the way, the NVIDIA Tegra X1, it is a built-in GPU and CPU. It's all on one chip. The CPU of NVIDIA chips are not as powerful as Snapdragon processors. They're not as fast. They don't have as many cores. They're not designed for that. So emulation relies mostly on high clock rates, on high gigahertz, high just muscle of the CPU, not necessarily grunt of the GPU. Emulation is more based on the CPU. It's in a more intense CPU load. Since the NVIDIA Tegra chips are not focused on CPU load, they're focused on graphics horsepower. That means they are not ideal for emulation in all cases. So I don't think we're going to see a bulk dump of GameCube and Wii games on the Nintendo Switch like we've seen bulk dumps of NES and SNES games. I think Nintendo is going to pick and choose certain titles, if they ever do this anyways, to devote the manpower to completely reprogram to be able to run flawlessly on the Nintendo Switch. They tested this in China on the NVIDIA Shield TV, which has the same Tegra X1 processor with Super Mario Odyssey for the Wii. They reprogrammed that and ported it to the NVIDIA Shield TV to run in perfect high definition, 1080p quality. But it was a complete overhaul of the code to make it work on an NVIDIA system on chip when it was originally programmed for an AMD or ATI graphics processor back in the day when it first came out. Oh, Super Mario Galaxy, I'm sorry. What that also means is that Nintendo does have Super Mario Galaxy sitting around ready to go on an NVIDIA Tegra X1 processor like is in the Switch. So if they do bring GameCube or Wii titles to the Nintendo Switch, mark my words, Super Mario Galaxy would be the first one, if not one of the first, since they already have it on deck ready to go on the Tegra X1 chipset. Now, the Switch would seem like it would be perfect for Super Mario Galaxy, but if you remember, Super Mario Galaxy heavily relies on the IR camera, at least for the Wii. The Wii remote had the IR camera sticking out the front of it, and you used the nunchuck in your left hand, or you could switch it right or left, however you wanted to do it. But the IR camera on the Switch Joy-Con, we're not even talking about Switch Lite, that does not have a detachable Joy-Cons or an IR camera, but the IR camera in the Nintendo Switch Joy-Con is on the right hand Joy-Con and comes out the bottom of the Joy-Con. It doesn't face out the top. The top of the Joy-Con obviously is the R button. So it would be tricky. How would they get around that? If they do port Super Mario Galaxy to the Switch, that's a game that relies on the IR camera. How would they get around that? I'm not saying they couldn't. There maybe could be some sort of trickery that they could use. Because remember in Super Mario Galaxy, you have the cursor on the screen that you use in different aspects of the game, mostly to collect the stars or the gems or whatever those things are. But you need that. So it'd be interesting to see how they would port that to the Nintendo Switch. I suppose they could just assign that function to the right control stick, the right thumbstick. It would be less tactile, but maybe it's something we could get used to. I mean, you can emulate Wii and GameCube games on a powerful computer, on a relatively powerful personal computer. It's harder to do on your smartphone like we just discussed, but if you have a a beast mode laptop or a desktop PC running a quad core processor and a decent video card or whatever, you can easily emulate GameCube and Wii games on a computer. In the way you play Galaxy there, I'm not saying that I've dabbled, I'll just say, without incriminating myself too much. Even though I have Galaxy, I own Galaxy on the Wii. Nintendo, I've spent my money with you. I own the game. So yes, I play Mario Galaxy on an emulator on the PC. And the way you do it is you just assign it to the thumbstick. And it's not as great as having the free-handed wand or the Wiimote, but it does function. So I imagine if they brought Super Mario Galaxy to the Switch, that's probably how they would do it. Actually, now that I'm thinking about it, they can also just use adapters. GameCube adapter, Wiimote adapter, some way that you can pair the Wiimote to the Switch, either directly through Bluetooth to the Switch or through an adapter. They'd have adapters, but if you didn't have adapter, maybe you could use the Pro Controller, maybe you could use the Joy-Cons. They'll figure it out if they release the game for the Switch. I'm not worried about that. All right, let's move on to more geeky stuff. So do you remember last year the Thailand cave rescue where they rescued all the Boy Scouts or whatever out of the cave? And Elon Musk tried to send one of his submersible robots over there to swim through the cave channels and pull the boys out. And the expert cave rescue diver said, "That's okay, Musk. We don't need your publicity stunt here. It won't work." And Musk replied to him and his criticism and little insult there by calling him a pedo guy. I have talked on the show a few times about my fascinating my fascination with Musk in general, how he's this billionaire genius, but also just as susceptible to the human condition as the rest of us. And sometimes he puts his foot in his mouth. Anyway, Musk took this so personally that he invested $50,000 of his own money to basically Facebook stalk and investigate this guy who said his robot wouldn't work, to try and back up his claim that he was a pedo guy. So he's looking at pictures of it. Basically, he thought that he met his wife when his wife was 12 years old, and after 50 grand, found no proof. The man's wife said she was 33 when she met her husband. So anyways, there's a lesson in there somewhere, I'm sure. More Geek Therapy Radio coming up. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Geek Therapy Radio. I'm your mental curator and host. Are they two separate things? No. I'm your mental curator, Johnny Hemberger. For some reason, me saying that just reminded me about the time I had George Norrie on my show. In between the break here, in between the second and third segments, I was daydreaming how wonderful it would be to host Coast to Coast AM just on a weekend, like just on a Sunday night or something, a Saturday night. Just guest host, fill in for a guest host. I think, does Ian Punnett still host on the weekends? Ian's great, but let's say Ian's sick. I would love to host Coast to Coast AM radio. That's the show I grew up listening to. That's the show that got me into radio. And that's also the show that made me think, you know what? The format that I'm producing here, called Geek Therapy Radio, that's not political, that's not meant to piss anybody off or drum up hype about anything, that there's a community there of listeners, like-minded listeners, who just want to share their hobbies and passions and kind of take delight in me talking about my hobbies and passions and sharing them with you, or talking about geeky things in general, that there's a place on the radio for shows like mine and Coast to Coast AM that isn't designed to hype up political events and designed to get you all pissed off and riled up and evoke that kind of emotion out of you. I'm trying to evoke some happiness out of you, some joy out of you at the end of each week. Or if you subscribe to the podcast, five days a week. So listening to Coast to Coast AM, like these guys, I'm telling you, I've been listening to Coast AM since, mid to late 90s is when I first got hooked on Coast to Coast AM. I used to run Coast to Coast AM, at least here in our Houston affiliate, for years when I was overnight board op for KTRH. So I freaking love Coast to Coast AM, and I would love to one day sit in and host Coast to Coast AM. It would be I'd probably cry through the first segment. I'd be so honored to do it. But I have had George Norrie on the show. He was a delight. He was one of my earlier Geek Therapy radios. Maybe in the podcast of this episode, I will include the link to the podcast where I had George Norrie on. That'd be fun to go back and listen to, because it's really, it was like meeting a lot of people have different celebrities they like to meet, different heroes they like to meet, but George Norrie is just OG overnight gangsta when it comes to talk radio and talking about aliens and conspiracy theories, and it's such a fun ghost stories. And if I hosted Coast to Coast AM, that's how I would run it. I would say, you know what, tonight is obviously going to be open lines, but I really want to hear the ghost stories. If your house is haunted, if you grew up in a haunted house, if you saw a monster or anything like that, I want to hear these stories. I want to hear just the deepest, most horrifying, or even lighthearted ghost stories. Just I want to sit around the campfire, basically. If I host Coast to Coast AM, I would love to sit around the campfire, and that is exactly what they do. I'm going to send George an email today, actually, and put my name in the hat that I would love to host Coast to Coast AM radio. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is what we call a rabbit trail that stemmed off of me simply saying, am I mental curator or host? Isn't being a geek wonderful? And we're all geeks about something. Okay, I remember what I wanted to talk about originally in this segment, and this is segment 3. For a peek behind the curtain, this is the 11-minute segment. So going off for 4 minutes about Coast to Coast AM and George Norrie. That's okay. I'm the one behind the microphone right now, and if I want to just geek out and spaz out about Coast to Coast AM, then by golly, I will do so. You are not bound by international law to have kept the radio station tuned to this channel while I went off on my diatribe, but we certainly appreciate, and I definitely appreciate, that you do stay tuned. If you're somebody who listens on the radio and you are just, I don't want to, this is not insulting. I don't want to say it insultingly. If you're old school and that you know that as of right now, this time of night on this day that Geek Therapy Radio airs, and you turn on your radio to this station to listen to my show on the broadcast, I love you. If you email me, geektherapy@iheartmedia.com, geektherapy@iheartmedia.com. I would love to hear from you if you're in that boat. It's this time on Saturday night. I need to tune into this station and listen to Geek Therapy Radio. I would love to hear from you. I think, Dump Truck Dan, are you out there? I've only done 1 or 2 live shows completely live, and Dump Truck Dan was my very first live caller to the show. I should touch on that real quick. I wanted to do more live shows. My plan was to do a live broadcast every last Saturday of the month. That turned out to be a lot harder, easier said than done. Not because doing the show is hard. I loved to do it. It was very fun doing a live show, and I love opening the lines to callers. However, if you're familiar with the station, we get preempted all the time for sports and college sports, and personal life things get in the way also. It was difficult to find a window to actually do a live show for Geek Therapy Radio, but that is still something that I would like to do, and that's something that will be done in the future. Maybe one day the show will be on 5 nights a week. That's what I'm shooting for. You hear politics, and then all of a sudden Geek Therapy Radio. Wow, wouldn't that be something? Just in the middle of all that, basically been sitting in the middle of the room while it's on fire around us here on Geek Therapy Radio, and have our own little geek tea party while the world burns. I will say that while I don't often get into politics on Geek Therapy Radio, I also don't shy away from it if I think it fits the narrative of the show. And I certainly have my own political opinions. Believe me, if I was going to describe myself politically, actually, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do that where I sit in the aisle, but I'll just say it's fairly center. There's things on both sides of the political aisle that get me riled up and piss me off. So, for instance, I'll take Greenpeace to task. I've taken the Green New Deal to task when I think it fits the show. To briefly recap, the way the Green New Deal pissed me off was that a lot of us are geeks and love classic cars that drink gasoline and breathe fire. And I have heard the sentiment that, old Chevys and whatever, they should just melt them down. They should be destroyed forever, not preserved. They had their time. No way! 1969 Dodge Charger? Just throw that away because it burns gasoline? Are you kidding me? You know how many works of art we'd have to throw? Okay, that is not the topic that I'd intended for this segment. That will lead into the fourth segment now because we're 8 minutes in. Going to talk about electric cars again, specifically Volkswagen, and that I'm a little bit sad. As much as I love old 1969 Beetles and Dodge Chargers, and I myself have a 1983 DeLorean, my main daily driver that needs a new starter now, it's been sitting for a little while, I need to put a new starter in it, but it's expensive, is a small block V8 that'll do darn near 200 miles an hour. I love cars of all forms, which means I also love, even as a geek, electric cars. Being a car guy and a tech geek, electric cars check every one of our boxes. They're so cool. They go fast. They're high tech. It just so happens that they don't themselves burn fuel. I mean, they have to charge their batteries with, let's face it, mostly fossil fuels right now, but that's not the issue. It's a happy plus that, I don't have to put gas in this thing? Wonderful. So Volkswagen and Audi, for instance, previously in the show, I was a spokesperson for Audi for a few months to advertise their e-tron. The e-tron is the first fully electric SUV that Audi and Volkswagen Group has brought to the U.S. I am no longer being paid to endorse Audi at this point, so this isn't an ad. Just it was exciting that 2018 marked the first year, 2019, that a luxury brand brings a competitor to the Tesla Model X, basically. That the Tesla isn't the only name in town, and that Tesla's writing is on the wall once the big automakers get on board, and you don't get much bigger than Volkswagen and Audi. So 2020 marks the first year that Volkswagen Audi Group starts bringing the people's car, Volkswagen, to the people in earnest, in forms that they can afford. It doesn't have to be a $100,000 Tesla. They're going to be cars starting around, just over $20,000 and upwards, but it's bringing EVs to the masses. And I'm a little bummed that in 2020 we won't get a certain model of VW, even though I know it's early on and they'll have to ramp things up and test markets and see how their first offering goes. I'm a little bummed that they're not going to bring what I want, at least in the first year, and we'll get into that in the new segment. Don't go anywhere. More Geek Therapy Radio coming up. Let's go into segment 4, talk about VW EVs. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Geek Therapy Radio. I'm your mental curator, Johnny Hemberger. In the last segment, I teased that we're going to talk about Volkswagen EVs, and that Volkswagen is bringing EVs to the common man in earnest starting in 2020. And that a little part about it has me bummed out. I am fully convinced that my first EV is going to be a Volkswagen. I have owned Volkswagens my entire life. You can call me a fanboy if you want. That includes all the highs and heartbreaking lows that come with owning a German car. Basically, it's just that if something goes wrong, it's going to be more expensive to fix. back in the day at least, I'll say that Volkswagens and Audis have gotten so much better than as I describe the dark times. The dark times are pretty much anywhere between the entire 90s all the way up to, I would say, 2009. 2008, 2009 is when Volkswagen and Audi kind of made some... they finally acknowledged, for the most part, that VWs and Audis had the worst electrical systems known to man. And the worst air conditionings. I mean, the air conditionings were great when they worked, but I've lived in Houston since 1989. If you bought a Volkswagen, you're happy to have your air conditioning last for a year. If you bought a Volkswagen in the 90s and anything before, 2010-ish. But anyways, Volkswagens just in general have gotten so much better, and I have no problem recommending Volkswagens to family and friends asking about, reliable cars that they should buy. Before my wife was my wife and she was just a friend, we gave her the recommendation of you should buy a Jetta. Jettas are a good car. She still has her Jetta. It's had no issues the entire time she's had it thus far. So Volkswagens have gotten much, much better, and I'm so happy for that because it means I am more confident in buying an EV. However, here's where the sadness comes in, other than just financially, maybe buying a car right now is not the best time, but who knows what 2020 will bring. The sadness for me with Volkswagen EVs is that they have no immediate plans to bring the ID.3 to the United States. And I, for months, was under the assumption that, sure, we'll get the ID.3, because for all intents and purposes, the ID.3 is closest related to the Volkswagen Golf. So the Golf and the GTI, that's pretty much what the all-EV ID.3 is closest akin to, and that was going to be my choice. I always thought that the Volkswagen Golf was almost the perfect car. In fact, I would go as far as to say that personally for me, I think the Volkswagen GTI is the perfect all-arounder car. If I could choose to have one car for the rest of my life, if I could only have one car for the rest of my life, it would be the Volkswagen GTI. It's fast, handles well, is very economical, and very versatile. I have moved from apartment to apartment in my old Volkswagen GTI. It has a surprising amount of space in there, especially when you fold the back seats. The GTI is the performance version of the Golf. Not to say that the Golf is any slouch. The Golf is a very, very good car. And matter of fact, I believe it's the most popular vehicle, single vehicle in the world. They've sold more Golfs than they sold Bugs. It's a very, very popular platform, a very, very popular car. The most popular single model of a car in the world. So I thought, okay, for sure, when Volkswagen launches EV around the world, the United States is sure to get the ID.3, the EV Golf equivalent, more or less. But that's not the case, at least at launch in 2020. And I understand this for economics standpoint. If a car company is going to bring their first EV model of a car to the United States, most likely it's going to be one of the top selling genres of car in the United States. And one of the top selling models of car, genres of car in the United States is the crossover, is the small crossover. So it's kind of like an SUV and a sedan. It's a crossover. Does it have any more storage space than a sedan? Not really. I mean, it depends. You can get sedans that have more, trunk capacity than a small crossover SUV, but that's neither here nor there, especially station wagons. I always thought if I needed an SUV, I was just going to get a station wagon, like a Jetta station wagon or a Golf station wagon. Volkswagen is one of the only companies in the United States still offering a station wagon. Yes, of course, I know the station wagon has been replaced by the SUV. People like the feeling of security they get in a big, giant SUV. They don't care that it gets 12, 15 miles to the gallon at best. They want that feeling, or that, I don't want to call it an illusion of safety, because modern vehicles are very safe. There's still a higher rollover chance in an SUV. But to me, station wagons have all the benefit of a normal compact car, a sedan, all the performance features of a sedan, but with all the interior cargo space of an SUV, plus the gas mileage of a normal sedan. So you can have your 35 miles to the gallon and be able to tote everything your SUV can, at least inside the car. No, a station wagon isn't going to have the towing capacity of a giant SUV. But how often are you towing? Most people. How often are most people towing something at any given time with an SUV? Yes, if you're listening, there are a lot of you who are constantly towing things with an SUV. That's one reason why you bought an SUV. You need to tow a boat, you need to tow a trailer, you need to tow horses, whatever you need to tow. But for the most part, 90% of the time, most people with an SUV are just taking kids to soccer practice. They don't need all that car. They just want to feel safe and big on the road. So I always thought the idea of a station wagon was better for my needs, since I'm not usually towing anything. I always thought if I need to tow anything, then I'll rent a U-Haul or borrow a friend's truck or something like that. Anyways, I'm sad that they're not bringing the ID3 to the United States, at least on launch. That is the model that I would have wanted right off the bat. They're bringing the crossover. Right now it's called the ID4. It might be called the Crozz, C-R-O-Z-Z, but that's going to be the first full EV Volkswagen offered in the United States, is the ID4 or the Crozz or whatever they wind up calling it. So I'm a little bit bummed on that. And once again, I said, I don't know what financially 2020 will bring, if I'll get into a new Volkswagen EV, if the only offering is the Crozz. I really want one. Part of me is thinking, well, just get an old Volkswagen e-Golf. It doesn't have the range or anything like that. But by then, it's going to be super, super cheap. It's still going to have 90 to 100 miles of range, which is all I need day to day. Remember, I have other vehicles. I have the DeLorean. My wife has the gas-powered Jetta. We'll still be able to go on road trips and do what we need to do. But for driving back and forth to work, just a daily commute, which is 90% of your driving anyways, EV. So by the time the Crozz comes out in 2020, the e-Golf might be less than 10 grand or something like that. It's going to be very cheap, and I might consider going that route. I will say, however, that if I'm financially capable or make the decision to, that the Crozz / ID4, as of now, looks pretty good for a crossover SUV. It gets good range. I'm sure it's going to be a great car. I'm not the type of guy who thought he'd ever want to be caught dead driving a SUV or a crossover. It's just not my cup of tea. But who knows? I may be swayed. I think the Crozz looks cool. If it's gonna be a crossover, it might as well look really cool, and it does look really cool. I really like the way it looks as far as a crossover goes. I would have loved an ID3 or the Golf EV replacement, but c'est la vie, that's not to happen in 2020. I believe by 2025, the mid-2020s, Volkswagen is aiming to produce, it's like 30% of its cars will be completely EV. 30% of its offerings in the United States will be fully electric. It might be 50%. Either way, Volkswagen is making an earnest push to bring EVs to the common man in earnest. We're all geeks about something. Be good to yourselves and others. Know that you are worthy of love, that you're worthy of being loved and loving others. And I'll catch you in the next one. Take care.